the negative parts of his character. He actually has to become a professional thief, and he has to develop his bravery, and so the old personality in some sense has to die to give life to the new one. And so and you see in Harry Potter series too, at the very end, Potter dies and then is resurrected, right? And that actually happens to a slightly lesser degree in the second movie, where the resurrection is aided by the phoenix tears after he gets eaten by that, or he gets chomped by that big snake, which is roughly speaking the same thing that's happening here. Sorry about that. Okay, so anyways, Pinocchio's dead. That's not good. So the next scene, we see them back at home, and he's lying dead on the bed, and Geppetto and everyone else are mourning his loss, and then then we see this magic transformation, and we hear the blue fairy's voice. And so it's like he's pushed himself to his limits, and a natural process kicks back in and revivifies him. But now he's no longer a jackass puppet, he's actually something that's real. And so then he wakes up and he notices that now, you know, he's undergone this proper transformation. He notices his hands in particular. And then he tells Geppetto, who refuses to even notice, he says, no, Pinocchio, you're dead, lie down. So, you know, Pinocchio convinces him that he's not dead. And then in celebration, they start the clocks again. And so time kicks back in at that point. And so then they have a big celebration. Music happens again, because this is a celebratory moment. And they dance, and the harmony is restored. The good old guy has his son, and so the house is properly set up, and the old state has its vision and its capacity for transformation, and the thing that transforms has the stability of the culture behind it, and so perfect. And then the cricket goes outside, and he's talking to the star and the blue fairy, and he says he's pretty happy about how this has gone. And so then she gives him this little medal, which is made out of gold, and it's a sun and it's a mandala all at the same time. And so it's made out of gold, and gold is a noble metal. It doesn't mate indiscriminately with other metals. It doesn't tarnish. And so it's a metal that represents the sun, and then he flashes his little badge at the star, establishing a relationship between his function as the proper conscience and his orientation towards the highest good. And that's it there. So he's got this little sun, he's wearing this little sun. So he's also transformed and developed as a consequence of this entire process. And now Pinocchio's conscience is properly oriented. It's oriented towards the highest value. And then the movie closes. And that's Pinocchio. So I'll give you a minute, and I'll take some questions and try to figure out how to shut my phone up. So does anybody have any questions? Yes.
You seem to have used a vaguely psychoanalytic approach to kind of extracting the inarticulated messages from the mythology and the stories and the religion that's developed over time. So could you almost say that those are kind of constructing this to a societal level out of an individual level? These are kind of the dreams of the collective unconscious?
Sure.
That's
exactly what they are. They're the fantasies of the collective unconscious. That's one way of looking at it. I mean, they also take a socially determined form, right? Because it's animated, and that's a technology, and it's obviously something that exists in a particular time and place. But yeah, it's a collective attempt to give voice to the oldest of behavioral patterns. And so here's one way of thinking about that, which we'll talk about in some detail, which you should have read about, at least to some degree already. The question is, where is that knowledge represented? And Jung would say, well, it's part of the collective unconscious, and it's got a biological origin. But his description of the biological nature of the collective unconscious is quite ambiguous. And I think that that's because it actually is ambiguous. Like, for example, we know that primates, and humans in particular, are at least biologically predisposed to be afraid of snakes. So we can learn that very easily. Now, you could make a case that it's more than biological predisposition, that it's actually built in, but I would say the predisposition idea is actually a better one, because you at least need the exposure to the snake to get it going. So that would take place as a consequence of your experience. So it's not purely biological, although it is the case that snake fear tends to become more intense as you get older, which is not necessarily what you would expect. And I just read a paper this week localizing snake fear in primates, and it was hypothalamic. It's really old. So because the hypothalamus is a very, very old part of the brain. It's older than the amygdala, and amygdala is involved in snake fear as well. So it's really, really old. So you could say, well, you're prepared to develop snake fear, like you're prepared to develop language, and like you're prepared to walk by your biological structure. Now, whether that actually constitutes the contents of your memory, which is what Jung seems to imply, is an open question. But it doesn't really matter, because so one time when I went to visit my nephew, he was running around in a night suit. He was only about 4 or 5. So he's acting out this mythological pattern, roughly speaking. And you'd say, well, how did he know how to do that? And the answer would be, well, it was represented all around him in the culture, in fragments. And like, kids are pretty good at putting fragments of stories together. That's really what understanding is to put fragments into story form. And so he'd watched Disney movies, and his parents had read him stories, and he did pretend play with the other kids, and all of those were like exemplars of this underlying narrative. They're variants of it, and because he can abstract and generalize, he's pulling out the central features of those narratives, the heroic features, and then embodying them. So you could say, well, the central features of these narratives are fragmented and distributed across the entire culture. And so they don't have to be exactly inside your head. They don't have to be part of your memory. They're distributed in the behavior and the actions and the stories of the entire culture. And you can put them together out of that. So, and people do that. That's why they're so hungry for stories like this one, or like Star Wars, or like Star Trek, or like the Marvel movies, or like Harry Potter.
Yeah, what you said about the last scene, we saw him watching it over and over again. My little brother did the same thing with the last scene of the first Harry Potter movie. The guy with the 2 faces.
Uh-huh.
He watched that probably 20 or 30 times.
Yeah, it's really interesting watching little kids interact with, because movies are unbelievably complex. I mean, by the time you're your age and you've seen, several hundred of them at minimum, the impact wears off. But it's really something sitting down with a 4-year-old who hasn't watched very many movies and walking through one with them. I mean, they're so turned on. It's just, I took my daughter when she was too young, actually. I took her to see The Mask, the Jim Carrey movie. Jesus, I mean, she survived it. I don't think I traumatized her. But she was sitting on my lap, and it was really like gripping a bundle of barbed wire. She was just like that the entire movie, and halfway through I thought, well, that's probably a little too much psychophysiological intensity for one small body, but those movies, they just have a massive impact on little kids, and they will do exactly that. They'll watch it over and over and over, and you think, what are they doing exactly? Well, they're trying to understand. They're gripped by it somehow, right? And it's like they're deeply curious. They know there's something in it, and they're trying to extract out what it is, and they'll repeat it and repeat it and repeat it and repeat it and repeat it. So they're hungry for the information, because it's part of rescuing their father from the chaos. That's one way of thinking about it. So, other questions? Well, good enough then. Let's call it a day. Whoop, there is one more question.
So, in Maps of Meaning, there's the idea that you keep returning to about, like, when you first encounter the unknown, it's first fearful.
Yep.
And then Jung has the idea of archetypes. So, are there other kinds of meaning that people will find in new information that's already patterned into them?
That's patterned into them or into the new information?
That's patterned into them, like via the archetype, do people actually?
Sure, well, they project the contents of their fantasy onto the unknown thing. And that's partly a process of self-discovery. You know, so for example, let's say that you're gripped by love at first sight or something like that. Now, you don't know anything about the person that you're tremendously attracted to, but you'll have fantasies about them. And in fact, your image of them is a fantasy. And if you take that fantasy apart, you'll find out what you value. So you're projecting yourself into the world, and you can discover, I mean, you may also discover something about them, because there may be elements of them that match the ideal quite nicely if you're fortunate, and if your ideal is, you know, of a reasonable sort. But you definitely encounter yourself when you look at the unknown, because you use your fantasy to structure the contact. You know, and the fundamental structuring is the heroic encounter with the unknown, because that's the pathway, that's the fundamental pathway of human beings, because we're information foragers, fundamentally.
So it's that automatic response to the fantasies as well that are part of the first contact.
Sure. Well, that's also, yes, absolutely. That's exactly right. Yes. So, I mean, you imagine this. Imagine that you're attracted to someone and you're too terrified to go speak to her. Well, what's happening? Well, you have a fantasy of a judge. And that's your imagined representation of your own insufficiency in relationship to the ideal. And you project that on this person as a judge, and then you're too paralyzed to even open your mouth around her. Very common experience. Okay, let's call it a day. We'll see you in a week.